You know, you've been waiting for this, and I think you're now ready because we're going to cover logical volume management, LVM. I know you're ready. Let's do it. Managing disk space. It's always been a significant task for sysadmins. Running out of disk space used to be the start of a very long and complex series of tasks to increase the space available to a disk partition. It also required taking the system offline. And this usually involved installing a new hard drive, booting to recovery or single user mode, creating a partition and a file system on the new hard drive, using temporary mount points to move the data from the too small file system to the new larger one, changing the content of the etc and fstab file to reflect the correct device name for the new partition, and then rebooting to remount the new file system on the correct mount point. You can tell I've done that too many times. So LVM is going to allow for a very flexible disk space management. It provides features like the ability to add disk space to a logical volume and its file system while that file system is mounted and active, and it allows for the collection of multiple physical hard drives and partitions into a single volume group, which can then be divided into more logical volumes. Yeah, sounds like it makes life a little easier. This volume manager also allows reducing the amount of disk space allocated to a logical volume. But there are going to be a couple of requirements that you've got to pay attention to. First is the volume must be unmounted. But secondly, the file system itself must be reduced in size before the volume on which it resides can be reduced. So it is important to note that the file system itself must allow resizing for this feature to work. The ext2, 3, and 4 file systems all allow both offline, which would be unmounted, and online or mounted resizing when increasing the size of a file system, as well as offline resizing when reducing the size. Now, you are going to need to check the details of file systems that you intend to use in order to verify whether they can be resized at all, and especially whether they can be resized while online. Know your stuff. Now, I always like to run new distributions in a VirtualBox virtual machine for a few days or even a few weeks to ensure that I'm not going to run into any devastating unforeseen problems when I start installing it in my production machines. One more, okay, I'll tell you this. I'll be perfectly honest with you. A couple of years ago, one morning, I started installing a newly released version of Fedora in a virtual machine on my primary workstation. Now, I thought that I had enough disk space allocated to the host file system where the VM was being installed. Well, I didn't look carefully enough. Turns out I didn't. About a third of the way through the installation, I ran out of space on that file system. But fortunately, VirtualBox detected the out-of-space condition and actually paused the virtual machine and even displayed an error message indicating the exact cause of the problem. Now, note that this problem was not due to the fact that the virtual disk was too small. It was rather the logical volume on the host computer that was running out of space, so that the virtual disk belonging to the virtual machine did not have enough space to expand onto the host's logical volume. Now, since most modern distributions use logical volume management by default, and I had some free space available on the volume group, I was able to assign additional disk space to the appropriate logical volume, and then expand the file system of the host on the fly. So this means that I did not have to reformat the entire hard drive and reinstall the operating system, or even reboot for that matter. I simply assigned some of the available space to the appropriate logical volume and resized the file system. But get this, all the while the file system was online and running the program. The virtual machine was still using the host file system. Then, after resizing the logical volume and the file system, I resumed running the virtual machine, and the installation continued as if no problems had occurred. Whew. Yeah, but I'll tell you, even though this type of problem might not ever happen to you or hasn't happened to you, Running out of disk space when you're doing a critical program, or maybe a critical program is running. It's happened to a lot of people. Everybody's got a story. And while many programs, especially Windows programs, are, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they're not as well written and resilient as VirtualBox. And Linux logical volume management made it possible to recover without losing any data and without having to restart that time-consuming installation. All right, so there you go, personal story. It's the truth. So let's talk about the structure of a logical volume manager disk environment. You see this picture, figure 1? So logical volume management enables the combining of multiple individual hard drives or disk partitions into a single volume group. Here it's labeled VG. So this volume group can then be subdivided into logical volumes, or LV, or even used as a single large volume. So regular file systems such as ext3 or ext4 can then be created on a logical volume. So if you look at this figure, 2 complete physical hard drives and 1 partition from a third hard drive have all been combined into a single volume group. 2 logical volumes have been created from the space in the volume group, and a file system such as ext3 or ext4 has been created on each of the 2 logical volumes. So adding disk space to a host is actually fairly straightforward, but in my experience, it's done relatively infrequently these days. But I'll show you the basic steps that you're going to need to go through. You can either create an entirely new volume group, or you can actually add a new space to an existing volume group and either expand an existing logical volume or create a new one. Now, you will come upon times when it's going to be necessary to add a new logical volume to a host. For example, after noticing that the directory containing virtual disks for my VirtualBox virtual machines was filling up the home file system, I decided to create a new logical volume in which to store the virtual machine data, including the virtual disks. So this would free up a great deal of space in my home file system and also allow me to manage the disk space for the VMs independently. There are a few basic steps for adding a new logical volume. Let's check them out. So you might have to install a new hard drive, but it is optional to create a partition on that hard drive. You'll then create a physical volume, a PV, of the complete hard drive or a partition on the hard drive. And now you assign the new physical volume to an existing volume group, a VG, or create a new volume group. Create a new logical volume, LV, from the space in the volume group. Create a file system on the new logical volume. And then you can add appropriate entries to the etc fstab for mounting the file system. And then you mount the file system. So here's an example that shows how to use a CLI to extend an existing volume group to add more space to it. Create a new logical volume in that space and create a file system on the logical volume. And this procedure can be performed on a running mounted file system. I do want to issue an official warning, however. Only the ext3 and ext4 file systems can be resized on the fly on a running mounted file system. So many other file systems, including BTRFS and ZFS, cannot be resized. Just make sure you know your stuff. If there doesn't happen to be enough space in the volume group on the existing hard drives in the system to add the desired amount of space, it just might be necessary to add a new hard drive and create the space to add the logical volume. So first, you got to install the physical hard drive and then perform the following steps. So it's first necessary to create a new physical volume, PV. So use the command on the screen here, which assumes that the new hard drive is assigned as /dev/hdd. Okay? So you type in pvcreate/dev/HDD. It's actually not necessary to create a partition of any kind on the new drive. This creation of the physical volume, which will be recognized by the logical volume manager, can be performed on a newly installed raw disk or on a Linux partition type 83. Now, if you are going to use the entire hard drive, creating a partition first doesn't actually offer any real, particular advantages. It just uses disk space for metadata that could otherwise be used as part of the PV. So here I want to show you an example of, we're going to be extending an existing volume group rather than creating a new one. You can actually choose to do it either way. So after the physical volume has been created, extend the existing volume group, or VG, to include the space on the new PV. So in this example, the existing volume group is named myVG01. So you type in vgextend/dev/myvg01/dev/HDD. So when you're creating the logical volume, well, you first create the logical volume, the LV, from existing free space within the volume group. So the command right here creates an LV with a size of 50 gigabyte, right? The volume group name is myVG01, and the logical volume name is stuff. So LV create dash big L plus 50 big G double dash name stuff my VG01. And now it's time to create a file system, because creating the logical volume doesn't create a file system. See, that task has to be performed separately. So I'll show you the command here that creates an ext4 file system that fits the newly created logical volume. mkfs-t ext4/dev/myvg01/stuff. And now we can add a file system label, because that's going to make it easy to identify the file system later in case of, some kind of disk-related problem that you may or may not encounter. E2 label/dev/myvg01/stuff. And now at this point, you can create a mount point. So we'll add an appropriate entry to the etc fstab file and mount the file system. Now, you should also check to verify the volume has been created correctly. After that, you just use the df, lvs, and vgs commands. So now let's say that you've come across a need to resize a file system. Now, the method's been around since the beginning of the first versions of Unix, and it's not gone away with Linux. It's actually gotten easier, however, with logical volume management. So it may be obvious, but if it's necessary, install a new hard drive. Optionally, create a partition on the hard drive. And then you create a physical volume, a PV, of the complete hard drive or partition on the hard drive. Assign the new physical volume to an existing volume group, a VG, or create a new volume group. And then create one or more logical volumes, or LVs, from the space in the volume group. Or you can expand an existing logical volume with some or all of the new space in the volume group. Now, if you created a new logical volume, create a file system on it. If adding space to an existing logical volume, you can always use the resize2fs command to enlarge the file system to fill the space in the logical volume. Then go ahead and add appropriate entries to your etc fstab for mounting the file system. And then mount the file system. So here's an example that describes how to resize an existing logical volume in an LVM environment using CLI. So it's going to add about 50 gigabytes of space to the stuff file system. Now, this procedure can be used on a mounted live file system only with the Linux 2.6 kernel and higher, and ext3 and ext4 file systems. I'm not going to recommend that you do so on any critical system, but it can be done. And I've actually done so many times, even on the root file system, but again, use your experience and judgment. With another warning, only the ext3 and ext4 file systems can be resized on the fly on a running mounted file system, right? Many other file systems, including BTRFS and ZFS, cannot be resized. Okay. Didn't mean to scare you, but I got to warn you. Naturally, if there's not enough space on the existing hard drives in your system to add the desired amount of space, well, it just might be necessary to add a new hard drive and create the space to add the logical volume. So first off, install that physical hard drive and then perform the following steps. It's necessary to create a new physical volume, a PV, and just use the command here, which assumes that this new hard drive is going to be assigned as dev/hdd. So pvcreate/dev/hdd. Now, it's not actually necessary to create a partition of any kind on that new hard drive, because this creation of the physical volume, which will be recognized by the logical volume manager, can be performed on a newly installed raw disk or on a Linux partition of type 83. So if you are going to use the entire hard drive, creating a partition first doesn't actually do anything for you. It just uses some disk space for metadata that could otherwise be used as part of the PV. So, for this example, I'm going to use a new PV to extend an existing volume group. Now, after the physical volume has been created, extend the existing volume group, the VG, to include the space on the new PV. And in this example, the existing volume group is named myVG01. VG extend /dev/myVG01/dev/hdd. So to extend the logical volume, the LV, from the existing free space within the volume group, the command here expands the LV by 50 gigabytes. The volume group name is myVG01, and the logical volume name is stuff. LV extend -L plus 50G/dev/myVG01/stuff. And extending the logical volume will also expand the file system if you use the -R option. And if you don't use the -R option, that task must be performed separately. So you're not going to get out of it. I'll show you the command that resizes the file system to fit the newly resized logical volume. It goes like this: resize 2fs/dev/myVG01/stuff in this case. And again, you got to check to verify the resizing has been performed correctly. And you can use either the df, the lvs, and the vgs commands to do that. Let me lay down a few tips, though, for you while you're working through. So you use the extended file system unless you have a clear reason to use another file system. See, not all file systems support resizing, but ext2, 3, and 4 actually do. So the ext file systems are also very fast and efficient. But in any event, they can be tuned by a knowledgeable sysadmin to meet the needs of most environments if the default tuning parameters are actually a little out of tune. You always want to use meaningful volume names and volume group names. Also use ext file system labels. They can be your friend. Okay, so guess what? We're going to wrap it up here. Linux Logical Volume Management, LVM. Now you know more than you did before, huh? All right, so stick around. I want to see you in the next video.